Hello, everyone. I'm joined today with Christopher J. Ferguson. Professor Ferguson here is a university professor. He's also a researcher. He's researched the GamerGate controversy along with Brad Glasgow, who I've also interviewed. And we're here to talk about his research and his findings looking into GamerGate. So, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thanks. How you doing?
Not too bad, Chris. Not too bad. Just a heads up, we are live streaming as well,
Awesome.
and I am screen sharing the beginnings of your research here.
Okay.
Obviously, there's a lot of questions. Some of them are just basic demographic data, you know, Gamergate, according to your research. Well, actually, first off, before we get to that, why did you want to research Gamergate?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, and of course the easy answer is that there was this public controversy over it, and I find some of these culture warish public controversies to be just kind of interesting, and so people were making a lot of statements about Gamergate. And I was just kind of curious about it. It was actually Brad who'd gotten things moving. I mean, in many ways, this really is Brad's survey. And this data was available, and when I started to hear about it a little bit, I sort of reached out to Brad and said, well, this might be something that's worth writing up in a scientific way, and let's see what we can do about it. And he was pretty excited about it, and that's kind of what led us to this.
Cool, cool. Well, I'm definitely glad that you both did this. I think it's useful data. It's probably the highest quality data that we have on Gamergate supporters. And it's also because it's a historical phenomenon, we'll probably never
Yeah.
get better data.
Right. As far as I'm aware, this is the only actual empirical paper on Gamergate. Meaning a paper that has actual data behind it. And there, I mean, there's lots of other things that are written about it, and certainly there are game scholars who have written essays about it, usually pretty negative. In fact, I actually got an invitation to a conference today that made me think. I was like, wow, what weird timing to have two things about Gamergate show up on the first day. So certainly there are people writing about it, but I think a lot of the writing, at least that I've come across, from game scholars, has been very much in line with, I guess we might think of as being like the Twitter narrative about Gamergate. A lot of like hand wringing and references to the far right and that kind of thing, but without necessarily there being a lot of data behind anything that is done, which I think is kind of a kind of a shame, to some extent. I mean, I think hypotheses are valuable, and it's important to look at these things from all different sides. But I wish we had more actual data on Gamergate rather than just a lot of speculation, which is what I think we mostly have at this point.
And you said you're going to a conference and they're talking about Gamergate there.
Well, I don't know if I'm going or not. So no, it just out of the blue. There was a conference that I got an email today. I don't know much at all about the conference, and and just to be clear, I'm not in any way trying to like uh, put that conference out and like drag it or anything of that sort. It was just weird that today, I don't think I've talked about GamerGate in quite some time, and then we're talking today at the same day. This like email came out of the blue, and saying that there's this conference of game scholars who are going to talk about. It's like the 10-year mark, right? For GamerGate, and so it's a conference kind of devoted to that and the impact of GamerGate on society, and and yeah, I mean, I would be open to going, but I'm getting kind of old and lazy, so I think my reply was kind of like, "Well, you gotta like pay for me to go." So
If they pay for me to go, I'll
I
probably go too.
yeah, and I wrote to the guide, and I think looking at the conference website, I think the tone was again kind of like I was saying that the sort of like Gamergate was a horrible thing, and it still has this kind of negative impact on society and blah blah blah. And I wrote back and just was very open, and I said, well, I have a much more nuanced view of what happened 10 years ago, and this is kind of where I'm coming from, and Yeah, I mean, I think there are things to talk about in terms of like, the experience some of the women have with harassment, but there's also the talk about like, the journalism and the game scholars themselves and the potential to stigmatize gamers as a whole. So I kind of like went back to this person who had sent the invitation, and to be clear, I don't know that the invitation was personal. He might have sent it to 1,000 people for all that I know. But he did write back, and he was very like, oh, that's actually pretty cool, and it might be kind of nice to hear from someone that has a different perspective than maybe is the typical, and so we'll see where it goes.
Hopefully,
If
somebody there at least presents the a
I have to wear
truthful
like a
viewpoint, let's
raincoat
just
from all
say.
the tomatoes or whatever that gets. That's what I said. I'm like, I might not be on message with what you seem to want. Is kind of how I put it. But he was actually pretty cool. And he said, well, maybe that's still okay. That would be a good thing. And say, well, I'm glad you. I was thinking, I didn't say this back, but I was thinking like, well, I'm glad you think that. I'm not sure everybody does. We'll see. So we'll see how that goes. It was just funny that happened to show up, on the same day that we're talking. And like I said, literally, I can't remember the last time someone has asked me in an academic capacity, at least, about GamerGate. It's probably been, a year or something like that. So
Yeah, unfortunately, data on this topic is hard to come by. Though you may be either disappointed or happy, I'm not sure which, but there is other data on GG.
oh,
Um,
good. No,
Now,
that's actually
not
good.
research, not necessarily like published. Well, actually, I think some of it has been, like the Women Action Media study. There's been 3 studies on GamerGate and harassment,
Mm-hmm.
and all 3 of them showed that very small number of people engaged in harassment. The
Yeah.
Women Action Media study, which has a pretty good methodology, the Newsweek/Brandwatch study, which we don't really know the full methodology of that because they never released it.
Yeah.
And Newsweek actually lied about what the study showed, which is incredible. They actually
Okay.
openly lied on their website. Um,
Interesting. Okay.
yeah. And then there's the third study by the Nimbus, though they use a pretty broad definition of harassment,
Yeah.
where I think just like insults against
Yeah.
groups of
Yeah.
people
Yeah. Yeah.
qualify.
Well, yeah.
But it's
Good.
like I don't
Good
know
luck
if
on
I don't
Twitter.
know if I'd call like harass. I don't think I'd say like insulting a group of people is harassment. But like okay, whatever.
Yeah.
As long as we're being
Yeah.
consistent in how we apply that, I guess we can look at this data. Um,
Yeah.
and then there's
Well, I know there was
also there's
the
been
FBI
some
investigation too that had
yeah.
come out some time ago, which seemed to make nobody happy, as I remember.
Well, the GG crowd was always pretty happy with it
Yeah,
because it turns out that there basically wasn't really that much harassment,
yeah,
which should make everybody happy, you'd think. But
yeah. That's not how it works.
yeah,
Yeah, not in any area is that how it works. It's anytime people are sort of worried about in a lot of the areas I do research in, obviously I do a lot of video games in general, not just on the sort of GamerGate topic, but like violence in games and the kind of air quote addiction issue with games, but also do stuff on like race and policing and other areas as well. And a lot of, I guess in many ways, you would think if you think the world is bad, a lot of the data that myself and my colleagues have provided kind of suggests the world is not as bad as you think it is in a lot of different ways. So like the world is not as racist as sometimes you hear, and or at least not the United States is not as racist as sometimes you hear, and violent video games don't cause school shootings, and like, hey everybody, this is good news. You've been worrying about this stuff, and it's not so bad, and people get angry, and that seems to be kind of the thing. If people are really upset about a topic, it seems like there's this like moral value in being someone who's upset about a thing, and we have to really fix this issue of, I don't know, chocolate bars. Chocolate bars are destroying childhood. We need to do something about this. And then you got like a knucklehead like me that comes along and says, hey, actually the data suggests that chocolate bars aren't that bad. Isn't that great news? And everybody's just mad.
well,
um, you know
there's also been data on you're not the first person to survey GamerGate, though I think yours is probably the best. Yours and Glasgow's work was I think probably the highest quality data. But there have been the one was a Kotaku in Action survey. I think they've done a
mm,
couple of those actually, where they've surveyed their own users. Now that's not all of GamerGate though. That's only Kotaku in Action.
mm,
Um, then there's also, I believe, Based Report did a sub survey, and Game Politics did as well, prior to Brad
mm,
Glasgow's work with Game Politics.
yeah. Oh, I remember game politics. That's a blast from the past. They haven't been around like a decade, have they?
For a while, I'm not sure how many years, But
Yeah, yeah. Well, maybe not quite that far, but yeah, I think they ended soon after GamerGate. I used to read them all the time. They were great. I liked them. But a lot of that was when I first got in the violent video game research area, and I was like a young, well, for relatively young assistant professor, to like right out of grad school doing this stuff, and it was really, really heated, and a lot of these aggression researchers were actually pretty aggressive themselves. So it actually was really kind of at the time, nice to read this site where like gamers were, and some people actually liked the research that I was doing, and that kind of stuff. So I sort of found it comforting, I guess, in for lack of a better word, to sort of read some of their stuff and feel like there are people there that kind of thought the same way I did, and and that was also in the time when it was going before the Supreme Court, this issue of like regulating game sales to minors and all this kind of stuff, and so it was kind of a stressful time. So yeah, I was sad to see that game politics is no longer with us.
all right, so for your methodology, let's talk about that. So you and Glasgow, or mostly Glasgow, you say, um, um,
Yeah.
you announced the project. You announced that you're going to be doing these surveys with the GamerGate people. You then, you, but there's requirements. In order to
Mm-hmm.
participate in the survey, you have to have proof that you support GamerGate, and that could
Mm-hmm.
be, and that proof has to be at least 1 month older than when he announced it. So you couldn't make a new account and then all of a sudden be like, "Oh, hey, yeah, no, I support GG with my brand new account." You had to have proof that you had supported the movement over a period of time or prior to the survey starting.
Right.
And this period where they took entrance was December 2013, December 2015 to January 2016. I was one of the
Mm-hmm.
participants too, by the way. I
Oh,
should,
neat. Okay, I did not
yeah,
know that. That's very interesting. Yeah.
yeah, and um, you require people to have a verified email address in addition to the proof that they supported GamerGate. You ended
Mm-hmm.
up getting 700 and hang on, let me pull up the exact amount.
I think it was 725 was,
725
yeah.
GamerGate supporters participated in this, and you had 55 questions total.
Yeah.
So pretty thorough here. All right, so
Yeah.
I think that that's a pretty good methodology, and it prevents people from being like sock puppets or trolls. Though,
Right.
though one of the anti-GamerGate people, maybe you could talk to him sometime if you want to. But he remains skeptical. He says, "How do you know that they didn't make the sock puppet accounts months or years ago in advance?"
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's a fair question. I mean, I think you can kind of get into that. It's a problem with all online surveys, right? Or any kind of survey research you do that's anonymous is you don't always necessarily know who it is that you're dealing with. But that would be this like weird level of four-dimensional chess, right? I mean, to some extent that I'm going to create a sock puppet account to make myself look like a GamerGate supporter, just in case, some researchers, and post a bunch of stuff to GamerGate as this kind of like trollish sort of thing, just in case these researchers come along in the future to do this sort of study. And yeah, I mean, I guess that's possible, but they had to show that they were doing some of the stuff in terms of advocating this position that GamerGate was advancing. So I'm trying to think of like I'm actually trying to be kind of generous and think of like why would somebody do this? Like why if someone is involved in GamerGate and supporting this sort of movement, and you're concerned about what they're doing, in terms of harassing women or something of that sort. Um, yeah, I'm sort of like, if the movement is, or the concern is that like the people who are identifying as Gamergate supporters are involved in some sort of harassment of women, like what's the argument to say, we need some kind of like magic sincerity detector wand, for each of these people necessarily to, verify what their like intrinsic motivation is for participating in this movement. If your concern is that there is this sort of mass of individuals who are doing something naughty, then this sort of like magic intrinsic motivation. I mean, I'm not really sure that that is in a way, because if you're saying this group of people is doing something bad, then that group of people are doing something bad. If they're doing that because they, are sincere, or they're doing it because they're trolling, I'm not sure, what the argument is that that
Well,
matters, even if it were true that a large number of these individuals were trolls, basically, as opposed to
well,
sincere
to be
individuals.
clear, he has no
Yeah.
evidence of this. I'm sure he'll tell you that
Yeah,
himself.
yeah. I mean,
It's just,
I'm trying to be sort of,
yeah.
think about like
But
maybe,
the
yeah,
Pinko
maybe,
Merchant, you can talk to him if he wants. He's a YouTuber as well. I'm sure he'd love to have you on his channel. Um,
yeah,
but yeah, I don't think it's a very serious critique. To my knowledge, that's not the reason Brianna Wu created those sock puppets. So,
yeah,
bit
yeah.
of an inside joke. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's weird. So I was sometimes get the names of everybody mixed up, but she actually has been on Twitter a few times recently, like sounding pretty, like critiquing like wokeness, or whatever. Basically, I think if I remember correctly. So she's actually has seemed, pretty rational in some of her tweets recently. So, but I don't really follow her super closely. So maybe I'm mixing her up with somebody else too.
Well, I mean, Brianna, I don't. I have a weird relationship with Brianna. We know each other.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. We've talked a couple times about the project and stuff, getting her thoughts and feedback, and
yeah.
yeah. And she's also in the political streamer world where I'm in too. So it's kind of weird that we run into each other all the time.
Yeah, because she ran for like mayor or something
No,
like
she
that,
ran
right?
for Congress.
Congress. Okay, yeah. All right, yeah, I remember something like that. Yeah, interesting. She's a very, very interesting person. Yeah, so it definitely is her that I'm thinking of, and she basically was kind of saying, if I remember correctly, maybe, and I don't mean to misconstrue what she was saying, but something on Twitter of the sense of like, well, maybe the progressive movement's gone too far, because a lot of different different issues. I don't know if it was around like DEI or something of that sort, and then she got a lot of like flack, for kind of saying that maybe things have gotten a little too extreme, on that side. And I was like, wow, I think I'm finding myself agreeing with Brianna Wu. That's pretty fascinating. But I think she comes up a little bit too as I follow the Blocked and Reported podcast a little bit too, and I think she comes up occasionally as a character there. But no, it's just kind of fascinating to see how these threads weave back and forth sometimes through politics. So
Yeah, no, her career is definitely taking an interesting trajectory.
yeah,
I've talked about her at length throughout the project. Not at length, but
yeah.
like a few times she's come up. And yeah. Anyway, let's get into the basic demographics of GamerGate. What your comprehensive survey found.
Hmm.
All right. So GamerGate does lean a bit more male. That's true
Yeah,
than the average population.
quite a
About
bit more.
eighty
Yeah, it was
eighty
like
nine percent is it?
yeah,
Yeah,
it's 89.2
89%.
percent male. Yeah,
Yeah. And that's I think roughly in line within like 5 points I think of some of the other surveys that have been done. So
yeah,
I think a couple might have had it slightly higher, like 87 or so, but or 86, but all right.
right. Yeah,
And then do you consider yourself transgender? 3% of Gamergate people identify as transgender. That
this is
probably
actually
is
kind of high.
higher, yeah.
Yeah, that's
Though
actually kind of high.
high compared to to the current, that's pretty high. Though I wonder if the younger demographics skew that a bit more.
That could be it. I mean, and what we've seen over time with sort of like trans and queer identification, just sort of generally, as you kind of are implying, there's been this sort of shift, right? That more and more individuals are identifying, as trans, as non-binary, as bisexual, as lesbian, so on and so forth. Although there's a whole other thread that argues like lesbians aren't cool anymore too. So I've heard that sort of argument, as well. But yeah, so and I think a lot of that is just because of a lot of like status signaling and incentives around adopting victimized identity status. So, if you kind of look at like who's identifying as trans, for instance, it certainly is true that more and more younger people are identifying as trans. Not like massive numbers, but certainly more than we saw in previous generations. And part of that's probably because there's less stigma. So individuals who may have been trans before were reluctant to endorse that because they didn't want to be stigmatized, and now it's there's some more freedom around that. But there's also the argument that on the other hand, you may have some other individuals who either are basically LARPing some kind of queer identity. They really are straight, and they date people of the other sex, but they claim to be queer because it provides them this kind of identity that gives them status, and they can claim to be a minority, and that gives certain leverage in this, particularly in left-leaning spaces. So there's probably but both these things are true. Probably, it's not mutually exclusive. But definitely in younger individuals, we're seeing more people identify as various types of queer identities. This survey, like you said, was back in like 2015, 2016, so it wasn't, as the full rush hadn't come yet. That I think probably if you ran these numbers, more like now, you probably would see, more individuals even than 3% perhaps identifying as trans. But that's also in part because sort of like the way we conceive of trans identity has morphed somewhat over time. That it's gone from kind of being like literally you want to get medical intervention, hormones and surgery to change, your secondary sex characteristics to match the gender identity you have, to more of a sort of a general sense of like, well, I was born a girl, but I like a lot of boy things, and maybe that makes me trans, kind of thing. And so I think that there have been some shifts in the definitions of what this means too.
All right. Now, a little over 70% of GamerGate supporters consider themselves heterosexual, followed by
Hmm.
about 15% that's bisexual, and about 5% that's
Hmm.
homosexual, and less than 5% that's asexual, prefer not to answer, or other, or none of the above.
Yeah.
Oh, actually, you break down the stats too, and I'll
Right.
just go on the bar graph. 73% heterosexual, 4% homosexual, 15%, almost 16 bisexual. And then the year one, this data doesn't show up for me for some reason, but we could just probably I'm sure it shows that GamerGate people are probably on average under the age of 40, right? Between like 18 and 40. It's like or 35.
Yeah, let's see. I'm looking at it in my. I got it open to the actual published study here, and I don't see if we see that. Did I not put we not put the age in there? Okay, we probably didn't put the age in there. So we're bad. We're bad. For not including the age. But yeah, I think they were. Yeah, obviously didn't have a lot of. In my recollection, a lot of 70-year-old GamerGate supporters necessarily. So they're probably skewing a bit young.
I think there were a couple who were seniors, but not
Yeah, there's
not
always a
super
few,
common.
right?
Yeah. Which of the following best describes your relationship status? 60% are single. Well, of course, they were single in 2015, 2016. This is
Yeah.
um, so 60% are single, 16% are married, 2% almost are divorced, half a percent are separated, 25.25% are, or 0.28 rather, I should say, are widowed. 7% are in a domestic partnership. I should just round to the nearest whole number, I think, moving forward.
Yeah.
And then 13% are single but cohabitating with a significant other. Okay. What made you want to ask for some of these demographic information that isn't necessarily like because like, asking people's relationship status, I feel that's a good question. I'm glad it's here. I think it's
Yeah.
interesting information, but I'm not sure what that would tell people about GamerGate specifically, other than what it specifically asks.
Yeah, I don't know that necessarily does. I mean, yeah, I think there again. I mean, this survey, it was actually Brad had put this together, so I think he was just trying to get as much information about GamerGate supporters as was possible to really kind of learn as much as we could about them. I mean, I think that what was interesting to me, the ones that we reported in the in the papers, we focus a lot more on like the gender, the trans status, sexual orientation, race, Hispanic ethnicity, and then the political views and such. And I think with the demographics, for me, I was kind of interested in this narrative that had emerged that GamerGate supporters were like these like mostly white men who were straight, who were right wing, conservative, or maybe fascist, or something of that sort. That were like really sort of really kind of coming from that like conservative authoritarian perspective. And for me, it was sort of interesting. I really kind of like break down the demographics a little bit and say like, well, they are definitely more male than they are female, but there were some women that were involved in it too. That on some of these outcomes, the supporters of Gamergate were maybe at least somewhat more diverse than we might have expected. Given this whole narrative about them being mostly white males, that were from the political right. So in that sense, I think it was kind of interesting to look at, the sort of stereotype that had emerged about Gamergate supporters and the actual, demographic data that we have about it.
Yeah, and I'd be interested to ask you about the narrative. I know that you cite in the paper you actually refer to some of the people who criticized Gamergate, like Shira Chess and Asia Romano, both of whom
Mm-hmm.
have declined to be interviewed. Actually, Asia Romano ghosted me after agreeing to do it. But
Oh, okay.
yeah, you actually you cite them. Of course, they didn't do studies or anything into this. They just wrote opinion
Right. Yeah.
pieces. But what is the highest level of school you've completed, or the highest degree you've received? Let's see. 28% some college but no degree, 34% bachelor's, 12% a graduate, 10% or 9% I should say associate, um, high school or GED 13, and less than high school 4%. Though I wonder if the some college but no degree, that number might be a bit skewed because some of those people were probably in college when
Well, in
Gamergate was
college.
happening. Like
Yeah.
myself,
Mhm.
like I think I probably answered at some college but no degree, but I later
Right.
got graduated, so.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is probably a pretty, leaning on the side of being a bit more educated than the general population and such. You kind of think of the general population probably has somewhere around a 35% college graduation rate, which actually is kind of about what we have here too. But like you said, but where this is skewing young, you probably have some of these people that haven't gotten all the way through their education yet, and so they're probably a little bit more educated than the general population on average.
Yeah, and which is interesting too. I wasn't expecting, I guess, bachelor's to be so high, but I guess that is probably about in line
Yeah.
with the average for the country now. So
Yeah, and graduate degree being 10%, that's actually kind of on the high side too. Yeah,
most GamerGate supporters, actually, this is kind of a little bit of a shock. Um, Slightly over half are Americans. I didn't know if it was slightly over or slightly under, because I've heard people say both, but now that we have
yeah,
data, I guess. Looks like about half, slightly more, were
yeah.
Americans, followed by the UK, Canada, Australia, Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, Brazil, France. Not really super shocking.
Yeah.
Japan's a bit low on the list, actually. Not th- I I think there might have been. Do you think the Japanese Gamergate people are underrepresented due to the language barrier?
That could be, and also just the mechanisms through which the survey passed around and social media. It's really kind of hard if you are in one country to get access to people in another country, for the most part. I mean, kind of like for online surveys, the best ones, or the companies kind of really best at doing that is Amazon, right? With Amazon, MTurk, and things like that. They're pretty good about getting samples from places outside the United States. Although they still end up being skewed in different ways, right? Because they pay small amounts to people that do surveys, and they're are people in some parts of the world that are more willing to do that for pay than you might get in other places. So, yeah, it's really difficult to get this like really sort of world representative sample of individuals. But I'd actually be kind of curious. I mean, I don't know how much also that GamerGate as a phenomenon, how much did that really translate to Japan or South Korea or places like that, or was it very much a U.S., UK, Canada kind of phenomenon, relatively speaking. And I don't know the answer to that. Like literally, I don't have the perspective of how much was the typical Japanese or Korean gamer paying attention to this as compared to or for that matter, let's say like Japanese newspaper, paying attention to this in the way that GamerGate kind of, made its way into mainstream newspapers for a while, in the United States. And of course, with any of these things, like, the United States is also the third biggest country on the planet, so we're, for almost anything, you're going to get a pretty good representation. But yeah, it definitely was sort of, Western, European, dominated, in the survey. But yeah, so I mean, it seems like we mostly were getting like North America and the UK, primarily with our survey.
Yeah, I don't really know how common in like South Korea. I guess you got two people from South Korea in your survey, but
Hmm.
from Japan, I'm not sure how like popular Gamergate was there. I know that some of the people who were like big, uh, some of the people who had like a lot of influence with
Yeah.
the torrential downpour stuff were Japanese, like Voken.
Hmm.
But like I don't know how many people like that there really were. I know that there were a few, but there's always going to be a few people from each country, probably, from global movement like
Yeah.
this. Latin America, you see, you had 10 people from Brazil, and then Argentina, two, and a couple other Latin American countries. Okay. I know that there was Latin America, they had like this whole separate discussion
Hmm.
going on relating to Gamergate. I mean, it was still the Gamergate discussion. I assume
Yeah.
I don't speak their language, but they had like their own live streams and stuff separate from ours, from the English
Yeah.
ones. But yeah, nothing too shocking here, because I guess this kind of maps onto where like the meetups have happened too. Like most of the meetups were in the United States. There were also a bunch in the UK, a bunch in Canada, a few in Australia. I think Germany did have a meetup. They said someone who was from Germany told me that. Um, I think France might have had a meetup too.
Okay.
And then there was like Hong Kong had one, and there were a couple of other ones too in other
Yeah.
countries. Pretty diverse across the U.S. in terms of where people live.
Yeah.
46% city or urban community, 42% suburban, and 12% rural. Anything shocking in there?
No, I mean, I don't think that's terribly surprising for most part. I mean, obviously, most people live in either suburban or city areas. Maybe we didn't get quite as many rural people, but maybe the whole Gamergate thing just didn't reach out into the heartlands quite as much as maybe it did. It definitely feels like kind of like a city coded thing. Like this, like Gamergate is like a Boston, New York kind of worry to some extent. So it didn't seem to get out into the rural communities as much. But yeah, I mean, most people live in either cities or suburban areas for the most part these days.
Well, you'd think if it were more conservative that it would be more rural, but I guess we're going to find out later on that maybe that
Hmm.
claim isn't as true as some people thought.
Yeah,
51% are full-time employed. Sorry, I'm going to go through relatively quickly since you have so many questions. And then more of the juicy ones show up later on. All right, last year in 2015, what was your household's total combined income before taxes in US dollars? Please use Google to convert dollars if necessary. All right. Less than $25,000, 21%. Though that could also be skewed because of the high number of people who were students.
yep, absolutely.
Yeah. 25 to 35, 12%. 35 to 50, 14.6. 50 to 75, 14%. 11% 75, but less than 100. 10%, 100,000, but less than 150. I'm not sure I buy that. No way. What do you think? 9% of people were making over 100 grand. What's the U.S. average?
So I mean, actually, the U.S. average probably I'm trying to think. I can look it up real quick too. I mean, it's median single person income. Let me see if I can find that.
Well, this is family. Oh, this is family though. It's just total
Yeah,
combined income. So
yeah. So it's median. Well, Florida's doing pretty good, actually. It turns out.
yeah,
As of 2022, why am I getting Florida data? It is 75,000. That's actually 74,580, according to the geniuses at NerdWallet.
that's the
Basically,
median household income.
median household income, median family income is 74,58.
Okay.
Basically 74,580. So actually, now I take it back. Florida isn't doing that good. Florida at 67,917.
Yeah,
So we're a little bit
that's
below.
not really super shocking. Yeah, because
Yeah,
as an individual that might be a bit high, but for
yeah,
household, for household that's probably
yeah, yeah.
within reason. What is your race? 70% white,
Mhm.
74, which I think is actually lower than the U.S. If you depending on if you count Hispanic or not, but
Yeah,
I think that's actually lower than the U.S.'s demographics.
yeah.
Um, so white people are actually underrepresented in GamerGate.
Yeah, and it is important to point out that that number does include white Hispanics. So ethnic, just like the federal government, ethnicity was considered as a separate question. So you could be white and Hispanic, or black and Hispanic, or something of that sort, or indigenous and Hispanic, so on and so forth. Yeah,
10% mixed race, 3% black, 4% Asian, 5% other, 2% or 1% Middle Eastern, and 1% Native American or Pacific Islander, 1% South Asian, and less than 1% indigenous. Well, so Gamergate does lean slightly male, but it's actually overrepresented in terms of minorities in terms of race.
hmm yeah. It's definitely much. I think this characterization of oh, it's really white. It was kind of when people kind of described it, there was a sort of sense of like this is very much a white male, a straight white male, kind of thing. And it is to some extent. I mean, certainly you got a lot more men, but you kind of do in these kind of like core gamer communities anyway,
Well,
right?
in like the United States
Yeah,
of America.
yeah. Right, right. And it is, it's certainly more white than other groups, with the caveat that we're including, a lot of, Hispanics into in the white category here. But it is, more diverse probably than what people were imagining. So again, that's kind of like the nuance, right? There's a lot of room between this is like a white male straight thing, versus this looks like the United Nations, and this is kind of in between. Like, yeah, I mean, there are certainly a lot of white dudes that are involved in it, but there's a lot of people involved in it too that don't really neatly fit into that stereotype of who was involved in Gamergate. You do have a non-trivial minority who are women themselves. You have a pretty good spread in terms of sexual orientation. A little bit of an overrepresentation in terms of trans identification. And yeah, it's the white is by far the biggest group. But you have a lot of people that don't identify as white primarily as well, and so it's just sort of interesting to see. Like, well, I mean, yeah, I mean, there's kind of the stereotype, but the reality is a bit more complicated than that stereotype would allow us to believe.
91% not Hispanic, 9% Hispanic. And again, most of this stuff, I mean, I don't know about like I don't know how many of the surveyors asked about like Latino or I don't think most of them did.
Mm,
Most of the other surveys,
yeah,
but most of the other stuff I think is mostly in line with other surveys that are done, like the demographics in terms of like race and gender, and in terms of the political views too. Do you have any children under 18? Hey, 12% were parents. Now that might be higher now.
yeah, yeah. They were. That's again probably going to that. This was a skewing young group of people.
Do you consider yourself Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Muslim, Hindu? A follower of some other religion, agnostic or atheist. Atheist, 46%.
Yeah,
That's
a
definitely
lot of
that's
atheists. Yeah.
definitely different from the U.S. population. Uh,
Yes. Yeah, atheist and agnostic are representing here. Right, you got a bunch of young, cynical people.
yeah. Oh, but so
They're all going to hell.
combined,
People are right about that. They're all going to hell, right?
so 70% if you combine them,
Yeah.
is that 70%? It is, yeah.
It
70% would
was, yeah,
roughly
somewhere around that. Yeah, pretty close.
are atheist or agnostic. That's a bit of a overrepresentation compared to the U.S. population.
Absolutely, yeah.
A 16% Christian, 2% Jewish, 2% Buddhist. I think Buddhist might be overrepresented too a little bit.
Yeah, that's pretty overrepresented, yeah.
Muslim, less than a percent. Hindu, less than a percent. Other, 10%. I wonder what the other is. Spiritual but not religious people, maybe, or it could be anything, right? It
Yeah,
could be any other group.
yeah, Wicca, all that kind of stuff, I don't know.
How
A
religious
bunch
would
of
you? Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, I was just gonna say like Jainists, other kinds of like weird,
Yeah.
not weird religions, but
Any other faith, yeah.
exotic religions. Yeah,
Not a huge shock that the majority atheist slash agnostic group is not very religious.
yep.
65% not at all religious. 18% not very. 14% somewhat, and 3% very. Which of the following devices do you most often use to connect to the internet? Desktop computer is over 60%. So this is kind of interesting, not because of the GamerGate angle specifically, but
Yeah.
because of it being a moment in time. Um, that computers were such a huge over 60% of what people were
Hmm.
using. I
Yeah.
wonder what the current ratio is for like current breakdown is in terms with smartphones and tablets and stuff. Because I feel like computers, I feel like not as many people use them anymore in terms of social media and things,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is unfortunate because like obviously you can do a lot more on a computer than you can with a smartphone.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I mean in a core gaming audience, you might see still some overrepresentation of the computers, because you do have that core group that are like computer gamers, right? As opposed to console gamers. Um, so they might still see some overrepresentation compared to the general population, as compared to like millennial soccer moms, kind of a thing. But so I think we probably would today, 10 years later, see a lot more representation of the smartphone, of course, to connect to the internet. But I'm trying to think in 2014, did I have a smartphone? Because I'm usually pretty late in adopting, some of the stuff. I probably did. But I think I probably still would have put, I mean, honestly, if you asked me today, I probably still would say like a desktop computer. But I'm also pretty old.
Yeah, I mean I would
So,
say so. I mean for like research and stuff, definitely a computer.
yeah,
If I'm just like
yeah.
listening to music on my phone with the videos, then it's a bit different.
Hmm.
What operating system? That's not really super interesting. 62% Android, 20% iPhone. You ask people about tablets. If you want me to actually jump into some of the, I feel like the tablet stuff in particular. Oh, I don't know. I screen share for you too. Hang on. I should probably do that.
Oh, I get it up on my screen. I get the survey. I'm just going
Oh,
along with you.
okay.
I get it on the thing here, so I can see.
Do you own a tablet? 44% do not. 7% have an e-reader. 16% have have an e-reader other than Kindle. 16% have a Kindle. 29% Android. 18% iPad. Oh wait, by the way, I'm not sure if you know, but um, the full interview that we have over voice is going to
Yeah,
be like the book interview.
yeah.
So I don't know if you feel like I'm copyright stealing your shit by going over your
Oh no,
survey.
don't worry. No, I don't worry
Okay,
about it. This is
all right.
fine. This is fine. Yeah, yeah.
Do you ever play video games on a computer, TV, game console, or portable device like a cell phone? Not a huge shock. 99% yes. 8% no. 8% no. Well, there were people who supported GG but didn't game, like Christina Hoff
Yeah,
Sommers. There
yeah.
were a couple people like that. I guess 8 of them at least.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't eight. It wasn't 8%, right? Which is eight
Eight
individuals.
individuals,
Was it?
eight individuals,
Yeah,
one
yeah, yeah. It
percent.
was like 1%. Yeah.
In the past 6 months, on which of the following devices have you played video games? Computer. Wow, holy cow. 96%. Um, 64% smartphone, 33% tablet, 42% Wii or Wii U, 41% 2DS or 3DS, 31% PS4, 15% Xbox, and I own none of these, zero. Or, well, three people, I guess, technically.
When they were going to the library and playing there or something. I don't
Well, they
know.
could be retro gamers.
Yeah, true, true. Yeah,
Like, I mostly play, well, I mean, I don't know about mostly, but like, there will be periods of time where I'll go like 6 months and I'll mostly just focus on retro games and not anything recent.
yeah.
Which one of the following devices do you play games most often on? 80 or 79% computer, followed by PS4 at 9%, 2DS at 4%, Xbox One at 4%, Wii at 3%, and this is including like the previous models and how you.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, this is a desktop group, desktop heavy.
RPGs are popular. Oh, of course, people can select multiple choice too. I should point that out.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So they love their role-playing games. 90% RPGs, 82% action, 77% strategy, 77% adventure, 76% FPS, 52% puzzle, 51% simulation, 48% MMO. That's actually pretty high, I think, for MMOs.
hmm
44% fighting, 42% survival horror, 30% racing, 27% MOBA, 25% rhythm, 11% sports, and 9% virtual worlds like Second Life.
yeah.
Well, with it being, I didn't know MMOs were so popular. Um, but I guess
It.
also, go ahead.
I know. I was gonna say it's also probably like the group of people who really get into gaming. So
Yeah.
like if you're gonna dedicate a lot of time to World of Warcraft or things like that, then you maybe more passionate about defending your hobby than someone who just likes to pick up a sports game, from time. Not to diss the sports game fans or anything like that. But there's probably like you think of like rhythm games. There's probably not like a lot of like Dance Dance Revolution people that are like super like following game politics and that kind of stuff. Like you were sort of saying. So
Yeah.
you probably see it more in like the first person shooter groups or the RPGs. And the MMOs are just like really big RPGs. So people that are dedicating a lot more time to what they're doing, and it's part of their social world, right? Because they get friends on World of Warcraft or things like that. They're probably just a lot more passionate, a lot more dedicated, and maybe a bit more. I'm going to use the word defensive. I don't mean it negatively necessarily, but they're going to be more in tune with people that are attacking their hobby than if you'd like just picking up Dance Dance Revolution from time to time and jumping around.
Yeah, and well, I guess this isn't super shocking either because like the number of times that Final Fantasy 14 or World of Warcraft have come up in conversations with people as I interview them,
Yeah.
it's quite often. So I guess that's not super shocking. What's your favorite type of game to play? Oh boy. All
Still
right, let's see.
representing the role playing here. Yeah.
42% role playing, yeah. Followed by first person shooters at 10. And what's third place? Let's see. Oh no, I'm sorry. Followed by strategy games at 14, then
Yeah.
FPS at 10.
Which I bet is probably different than a lot of people might have thought. And maybe I'm speculating here a little bit, but I think probably people are thinking these are like first person shooter guys, right? That are, highly aggressive and this sort of stuff. Where it's really these role playing. These are like the people playing Baldur's Gate 3, right now that were really involved in a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, yeah, you'd think well, like it's you've seen the Gamers Are Dead articles, I assume, yes?
Say that again?
You've seen the Gamers Are Dead articles, I assume?
Oh, God, a long time ago. Yeah, yeah, I remember that.
Well, I'm sure you saw the picture of the guy screaming on his microphone that Leigh Alexander's article had on it. And it's like this guy who's like is this like really fat guy. Philly fat white
Yeah,
guy screaming at his microphone. Um, that's probably what most people think of when they think. Well, most people who don't know anything about GamerGate are just basing it on
yeah,
what they heard from the media or whatever.
yeah.
That's probably
That's
what
the
they think.
general like gamer stereotype, right? Is the like mid-20s, yeah, neck beard, overweight, unhealthy, white, straight but no girlfriend, kind of stereotype. So I mean, I think gamers have kind of had to deal with that as a stereotype for a long, long time, and it just sort of meshed into this whole Gamergate stereotype as well.
91% use Steam. So I wonder. I want to ask. Do you
Yeah.
think? Do you? Or well, I should ask you this openly. Do you have any reason to think that did GamerGate supporters lean more towards computer games, or did the people who play computer games were they more likely to be on social media, on Twitter or Reddit or these other platforms where you and Brad promoted this survey?
That's a really good question. I obviously can only speculate about it, but I think what you kind of see is like this like overlap of like the role playing was pretty heavy. So role playing games are going to be, certainly in 2014, at least my memory is, it was more popular to play role playing games than first person shooter games on computer systems. Now, when I say that, I'm going to get a lot of people saying, "No, I play first person shooter games on a computer," and other people are going to be like, "No, I play my role playing games on a console," and that's fine. I'm not trying to say that that doesn't happen, but like Baldur's Gate 3 right now. I mean, I've been playing it off and on, and I got it on a laptop. Whereas I play other games on consoles and stuff. So there does seem to be this like whether it was a situation that like Gamergate supporters really kind of weighted towards these like really passionate role playing, but like other types of games too, but like really were involved in a lot of these like deeper role playing games, and maybe that's why they were a bit more passionate, about their hobby, or if they were on computers and on the internet. I mean, so there's the argument too that is probably a lot easier to fill out a survey if you're on a computer than if you're on your smartphone. Well, I can say that firsthand. That definitely is the case. So there may be a confluence of factors that sort of that particular group of people are a bit more overrepresented in this population of individuals. Well, it's probably not just one thing. They probably were, my speculation at least is that they probably were both more involved, in being interested in the stuff that's going on with GamerGate, and maybe they were even more likely to read the articles, on computer than on smartphone. But on the other hand, it's probably also true that it's just easier to fill out a survey on a computer than it is on a smartphone
Yeah.
as well.
Plus, to be fair, like to be clear, none of this says that you can't play games on both, of course.
You're right. Is
Uh,
that yeah,
yeah.
exactly, yeah, precisely.
And it sort of makes sense that I've reached out to a lot of GamerGate people. I've interviewed over 50 of them for my book. Um,
Yeah,
and the fact that this is a group of people where I feel comfortable going to them and being like, "Oh, hey, do you want to jump onto my live stream and do an interview with me with your gaming headset or with your mic or whatever the fuck you've got?" And they're
yeah,
all like, "Yeah, absolutely, let's do it." And like almost nobody's like, "Oh gosh, I don't have any way I could do this." It's not like,
yeah,
or I have to use my phone. Like
yeah,
there's not been any
yeah, yeah,
instances where that's been a problem. Whereas I feel like
yeah,
if you approached like a random group of gardeners, like if you approach 700 gardeners
yeah.
and like you ask them, "Hey, can you jump?" or 50 gardeners, let's say, and you ask all these gardeners, "Hey, can you jump onto a live stream and talk to me for 2 hours about Gamergate or about gardening?" They'd be like, "Oh, I
Gardening
don't
gate.
have." They don't. Yeah, Garden Gate. They probably wouldn't. Like, I bet you'd get a lot of people who'd be like, "Oh, I don't know how to do that."
Yeah,
Whereas you
that
don't
is
really
very
get that
true.
with the
Yeah.
Gamergate crowd.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that is absolutely true. Yeah, and like you said, I mean, like even in my own gaming experience, I play in everything, right? So I have courtesy of my university, right? I have both a PlayStation and an Xbox. So that's kind of fun. And but I also play on computer. Depends on there are some games I like to play more on computer, like RPGs and like strategy games, typically like Civilization or Hearts of Iron or that kind of stuff. They're just easier to play on a computer. And other games like the shooter games, I tend to prefer to play on a console of some sort. But and I don't play these games a lot anymore, but there were always were like the Angry Birds, right, and like the Plants vs Zombies that were fun to play on yeah, on a smartphone or something of that sort. So yeah, I think a lot of people do kind of just switch back and forth between different types of platforms depending on what kind of game they're playing and whether they're playing socially or playing alone or a bunch of other different things are kind of going on. So yeah, I think it's easy to kind of say, well, this is like one group of people who are playing one way, and the reality is, that they're probably mixing and matching. That's kind of what we see in the data too, right? That role playing games were the most popular, but they're also playing shooter games and they're also playing puzzle games and they're playing other types of games too. So it's not like a really narrow group of people necessarily that we're talking about here.
No, yeah, I agree. It's not. How many Steam games do you own? More than 200.
200, yeah.
35%. I think I might have answered that too. Let's see. How
That's a lot of games.
I'm
My
at
wife was saying
465. Dare I ask what you're at?
oh god, I probably don't have any. I'm probably in the I'm probably in the 20 to 40 range. It's a little tricky though too because I get when I do games for research, some of those end up on Steam too. So I'm going to make it sound like it's not so bad by saying that my university has bought some of those games and that they're only for research, although that's probably not entirely true. But some of them are lab games, but most of them are. And even the lab games I've played for fun, to be honest with you. But so it's probably in the 20 to 40 range somewhere. I tend to like grab a game and like play it for a long time, particularly when I'm playing either the RPGs. Like I've been playing Baldur's Gate since December is when I picked it up, and I'm still kind of working my way through it. And any of the like strategy games like Civilization or Hearts of Iron or Europa Universalis or something of that sort, I can play those for like 6 months, and just doing different scenarios and trying it over and over again. So as a consequence, I end up with this like huge backlog, or like Elden Ring. I played that for like a year, and so I end up with this like huge backlog of like I've been threatening for years to play The Last of Us 2, and I still haven't. And so I have this like backlog of games like that. Like, yeah, I really should get around to playing like The Last of Us 2 at some point, and I just haven't for years and years and years. And eventually I will. Hopefully, I'll actually be able to go into like a GameStop and get it for $5 or something like that before they all go bankrupt or something.
Yeah, I'll never get through this backlog. I don't even buy games that often on Steam. It's just really not not often at all. But
Yeah,
being in high school and having a job and my parents not charging me rent, it had some perks.
yeah,
Except
definitely.
I'll
Yeah.
never get through all of these.
The one downside about Steam and any of the other kind of like online systems like Xbox Live or that kind of stuff, or the PlayStation Store is my son and I each have we like a lot of the same games, so we played all the Dark Souls and all this kind of stuff together. And for me it's really old school, but there's an advantage to some extent of having like the digital or the actual like physical copy, and that we can just kind of trade them back and forth, and although I mean you can do that with some of the Xbox games and stuff like that too, where you just switch who the user is and that and all that, but it's just a little bit more convenient sometimes. Like, okay, I'm done with this game. Do you want to play it? And you just kind of move it back and forth rather than worrying about Steam or any of these other online systems. So
See,
yeah, so I mean, they're it's got its advantages both ways, and like I said, the one thing I'm still a GameStop fan. I know I'm like probably the only one left. It's sort of like how I have like an AOL account, so I'm probably like the only person on the planet still has AOL for an email. But I'm cheap, so I like buying like used games that are less expensive, that have these physical copies, and then I can sell them back for a couple bucks. So that's always kind of neat. That's what I'm planning to do with like The Last of Us 2. I'm waiting until it's going to be like $7, and then I'll finally buy it and play it through and then sell it back for like a buck or something like that. So like I said, hope I'm just like keep my fingers crossed that GameStop doesn't go out of business before I actually get to play Last of Us 2. They're hanging in there. I'm optimistic. We'll see.
did you participate in the GameStop short squeeze?
I did not know. I did. I thought it was hilarious, though. And like I said, I'm rooting for GameStop to survive. I don't know how they're going to do it, but so I thought it was super cool, and it was kind of funny to watch like the reaction to it from a lot of people, like how dare these upstart people screw with the system, sort of thing. And it's like I thought you guys were all for like rebels, like the small people, like getting it back against these titans of industry, but apparently not. Uh, Not when they're gamers, I guess.
Many people have different opinions about video and online games. For each of the following statements about video games, please tell me if you think it is generally true for most games, true for some games but not others, generally not true for most games, or if you're not sure. All right. Video games help develop good problem solving, and strategic thinking skills. 58% agree for most games.
Yeah, it's
40%,
going to turn out gamers
41%.
like games, right?
Yeah. Well, I think this is a good set of questions to ask too.
Yeah, yeah,
So 58% think that that's true for most games, 41% for some games but not all.
yeah.
Video games are a waste of time. 77% say not true for most games. Video games portray women poorly. 82% say, or sorry, 83% say not true for most games. Video games promote teamwork and communication. 71% true for some but not others. So, what do you think of the video games portray women poorly question?
I mean, I'm not surprised, by this. I mean, I think that most people who are into games don't tend to see it that way, and I know that that differs from, say, like game study scholars who would probably have exactly the opposite set of responses.
What's a game studies scholar?
Oh yeah, so maybe you're better off not knowing. So there's a whole discipline of social science that's devoted to studying video games. So it's basically game studies, in essence. So there are a variety of psychologists and communication scholars and sociologists and all this thing. So there's a whole academic discipline that's called game studies, and they tend to be, which I'm part of, I guess, unless they disown me. But they tend to be very progressive, in their view, like politically progressive, not like progressive in any other sense, but very progressive in their views towards these sorts of things. So it probably would be taken as a absolute truth that there's a widespread problem with the portrayal of video games among academics who study video games, game scholars. And unfortunately, that's kind of what you see a lot of times, like with academic disciplines, is you find people that study a topic, but they're like super negative about that topic. It's sort of like American studies, right? That it's actually, I heard someone describe it as like it's really like anti-American studies, kind of a thing. And so game studies, even though probably most of the scholars who are into game studies probably do play video games. They're really, really sensitive to this idea of what we might think of as like problematizing games. Finding something wrong with games. Are they racist? Are they sexist? Is there too much violence? Is there too much of this or that or the other thing? And I think that's moved in a direction like a lot of other stuff. Like I think if I were to look at this like 15 years ago, I wouldn't have said the same thing about game study scholars. I think like a lot of places like news media, and academia more generally, that there's been this shift in the narrative to being very, very negative. In this case about video games, and I find that to be kind of a shame. That is the case. But yeah, so that was my comment. I think you'd find a very different set of responses if we asked this to game studies, scholars. But yeah, I mean, obviously this group doesn't really care about that issue too much. They're not too worried about the way that games are portraying women, and yeah, in terms of what the truth is, I mean, I think that if you kind of like looked at this, and and I'm familiar with Anita Sarkeesian's series on the portrayal of women in games, which and maybe your listeners are going to hate me for saying this. I actually liked her first video. I thought her first video was pretty good, and I think she has some fair points in it. So I mean, maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. That if you went certainly back to like the '90s, there probably was some fair criticism of how women were portrayed in video games. You get like the chainmail bikini sort of syndrome and all that kind of stuff. But I think video games have gotten a lot better over the last 15 to 20 years, and I don't think they get as much credit for that as maybe they deserve. But on the other hand, too, I think that's when you kind of get into activism, right? You never want to actually fix the thing you're, advocating for. Then what do you do, right? So you just keep moving the goalposts. So I think there's a certain element of that with this issue of like how women are portrayed in video games. It's gotten much better. It's certainly not perfect. You certainly can find some games that maybe are pretty negative in their portrayal of women, but I think also the advocates keep moving goalposts around so that they still have something to do, right, and complain about.
Well, it sounds like in this games academia space that there's not like a plurality. There's not a pluralistic approach to hearing a wide variety of perspectives. Is that true?
True, absolutely, yeah, and even if you look like at politics, right? And I'm center left myself, so I'm certainly not a Trump supporter or anything of that sort. But and I don't mean to get involved too much in politics, but if you look at like the politics of people get involved into like communication as a field, communication studies, which is largely video, game studies is largely a part of that. I think you'd really struggle to find a conservative. You know what I mean? Like one. There's it's probably one of the most progressive liberal spaces in all of academia, which is saying something. You know what I mean? Like where it's generally hard to find a lot of conservatives in academia, but like even with that in mind, communication studies, empirically speaking, I mean there have been surveys that looked at this. Empirically speaking, communication studies is one of the most liberal progressive, even for academic studies.
Is there anything that can or should be done about that?
It's really hard to do it. Yeah, I mean, in a sense of we don't. I don't think we want to put into a system of like political affirmative action, right, or anything of that sort. Like you have to hire like 50% conservatives. I mean, there is this issue of like academic freedom and all that sort of stuff that I do think is important. I mean, what if communication studies or other fields like psychology, so I'm not trying to specifically target them either, but or English or history or whatever, really wanted to be more pluralistic. I mean, the disciplines themselves would really have to make an effort to do that, and say like, we really want to think about, here we're kind of on this path, and it's really good that we have some scholars who are progressives. We really want our students to hear some of that, but they probably would benefit from hearing from some more conservative perspectives as well, so they get a much more well-rounded education and set of views that they can think about critically and so on and so forth. And that's something obviously outside of games that I've been trying to advocate for in general, is that we really ought to think about this sort of like we refer to as like intellectual diversity, right? Essentially, that we really ought to be inviting scholars with a variety of opinions to participate in dialogue and teaching of students and this kind of stuff. And that hasn't been the way that academia has moved. And even it's always been liberal, or at least within my lifetime, it's always been liberal. But even within the last 10 years, it has moved, much more in the direction of being much more rigidly progressive. And you probably heard like some of the talk about like the cancel culture and all this kind of stuff. And even liberal professors being shouted down because they weren't liberal enough, and all this kind of stuff. So we've had a pretty big problem with that in academia, very broadly. So if you're talking about like race or sexuality or gender identity or any of these things, it's really kind of hard to say anything that's off message, if you will, and that happens in this space too. And I remember like one time I used to be on all these academic listservs. And I've gotten off of most of them at this point, just because they're just so, as stress, it's just people arguing all the time. And I remember one time someone had said something, and it was in reference, I think, to I don't know if it was directly in reference to GamerGate, but it was stuff like related to it at very least. And there was this kind of this perspective of all gamers. It was like that kind of discussion. Like, gamers have this problem with being like anti-woman. Gamers have this problem with being right wing. Essentially like fascist. I don't know if that word was used, but that was kind of like the portrayal. And I actually, and keep in mind, I'm fairly old. I mean, I have tenure. I'm a full professor. So I've got as much protections as any scholar does. And I kind of piped in and said, well, that's, I'm a little bit concerned that, we're sort of like making these sweeping generalizations about all gamers, that I'm sure, some gamers behave badly, but that's true for any group, right? I mean, you could say that about academics, that some behave badly. And then, I think I made the mistake of saying something like, we wouldn't like do this with other groups, right? Like we wouldn't say because, a couple Irish people have committed acts of terrorism, that all Irish are terrorists, or that because a couple
Mm.
people who are Muslim have committed acts of terrorism, that all people who are Muslim are terrorists, or that sort of thing. And that, of course, was the wrong thing to say, right? Because then all of a sudden it's being, Islamophobia, right? Nobody cared about the Irish, by the way. And so there just became this like back and forth, argument, and so if you kind of think about that, well, I'm a big boy, I get tenure, it doesn't really matter, people can get kind of crazy or whatever they want, and in fairness, other people on the listserv did defend my comment, including some of the Muslims that were on the listserv. Said this isn't Islamophobic. He's saying Muslim people aren't terrorists. How's that Islamophobic? But it was really kind of like the negative environment is the punishment in a way, right? So if you're a junior academic and you see this happen, like this guy, actually made some kind of defense of gamers, or something of that sort, and then he got all this grief for it. Why would I bother doing this as an untenured junior professor with no protection whatsoever? So I think you end up with these kind of like really, I hate to use the word toxic because I think it gets overused, but certainly conformist cultures, and again, I don't think that's unique to communication studies. I think that's true for psychology and other places too. But that certainly is a problem that we have in academia right now, that if you are off message, you get shouted down by the loudest, most neurotic people in your discipline. And so I think a lot of the issues that we have in academia around game studies, kind of relates to some problems with that.
You say not a for like affirmative action for conservatives. I'm not conservative at all myself. I mean, I might be on like some specific issues, depending on what it is. But I'd be open to like hearing out an idea on that because I think that not 50%, but like probably there shouldn't be the case that any academic field is dominated 80 plus percent by one group. Like it
Yeah,
probably would be useful if there were conservatives or libertarians in these different areas.
yeah,
And like I don't know how I don't know if like having like some sort of like a affirmative action for ideas, right? Because
yeah,
I think there is real value in having a diversity of ideas being
yeah.
presented
Oh, I
in
do
an
too.
academic
Yeah,
setting, 1,000%. And that's sort
yeah,
of the whole purpose, I guess. One of the whole purposes is to explore
yeah.
the truth and explore things from different angles.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think in the communication studies, it's like nearly 100% liberal progressive. So it's not quite, but it's pretty close to it. And and in fairness, it's not much. Psychology is not much different. So again, I'm not trying to single out communication studies and say, well, we have things a lot better in psychology because we don't. And I agree. I mean, I think probably the way to do it is to think of like conservatives could donate. I think the problem is that when conservatives look at this, they kind of want to like defund universities, right? So it's just the opposite of defund the police, right? And I understand like why conservatives are upset at universities, and I think universities have shot themselves in the foot pretty badly over the last certainly decade or more. And yeah, I think the reaction of conservatives has been to kind of like stop funding. And in some ways, I hate to say it because it's my job is an academic job, but I get it. Like I'm almost becoming sympathetic in some respects, especially after all like the anti-Semitism thing at like Harvard and other places this last few months. I sort of get it, but on the other hand, I think that like something more constructive is for conservatives to find ways to fund specifically the kinds of things that they're interested in academic worlds. Because I can tell you that like what universities want is money, and if they can get money, by bowing down to these like critical social justice views, then they'll do that, But if they can get money by, sort of like creating a think tank, about like conservative political ideas, or funding some lines of research that look into economic theories that conservatives are interested in, then or create a endowed chair in create the Ferguson endowed chair in psychology and video game research at Stetson University. If anybody's hearing this and wants to do that, shoot me an email. We'll talk. So there are ways. Yeah, I probably would. I'm not a conservative enough to be able to do that, but you know what I mean. Like there are ways to do it, but it would have to be, conservatives first off would have to encourage their kids who are conservative to get into academia, which conservatives tend to drift more into business where they can make money. So you'd have to say like you'd have to like convince some of your kids to want to become historians, or English professors or that sort of stuff to sort of balance things out.
Well,
And yeah.
thinking of balancing things out, I know you said that you have your D&D. Is that in 15 minutes or is that an hour and 15 minutes?
That is in 15 minutes. Yeah, that we have that coming
Okay.
up.
All right. Well, we haven't even got to the good stuff yet. Sorry. Oh, shoot.
Oh yeah, it's all good. It's all
All
good.
right. All right. So suffice to say, some people use the term. Well, real quick. Most GamerGate people, 81% or 82% think that video games do not portray minorities poorly for most games. And 71% consider gaming to be a better form of entertainment than TV. Not a huge shock, I guess.
Yeah,
In most cases,
I
at
would I
least.
would largely agree with that, but I mean I like watching TV too, though. So
All right. Some people use the term gamer to describe themselves as a fan of gaming or a frequent game player. Do you think the term gamer describes you well or not? 94% yes.
yeah, not a shocker there, I think. Um,
All right. So when did people get involved with Gamergate? 68% got involved in August or September, mid-September.
yeah,
Um, and then 23% from mid-September to December. 8% from January to August 2015, and 1% after August 2015. Okay. 83% use Twitter to support Gamergate, 72% use Reddit, 32% use Facebook, 40% use 4chan or 8chan, and 24% use another platform. I don't think we're going to get through all this. Do you want to skip to the more political stuff, or?
yeah. That's the fun stuff, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna quickly go through um,
That's the
if
gotcha,
there's
right? And
anything
all this stuff.
useful. Well, that yeah, not gotcha. It's just like it's the data, you know.
Yeah. It's the fun. I think it's sort of fun. I mean, I think this stuff is interesting, right? Away, so like, yeah, it happens to me too. Like something I think like, well, I think X causes Y, and then like a really good study comes out and says, well, X doesn't cause Y, and I think that well, that's fascinating. Actually, that's actually pretty interesting,
All right,
right?
so what the
Go
fuck
ahead.
was Gamergate? Let's look at what your people said. Um, Ethics in games journalism, 35%. The fight against social justice warriors, 30%. The fight against censorship is 28% roughly, or 20. Say so. Okay, but people can only pick one, I assume.
Let me see for this one. I think it was. I'm trying to think if he had like a little rank thing for this. Yeah, I believe it was. Yeah,
And then
this is the top one.
almost
Yeah,
10, like 8% said other.
other. Yeah. Yeah, it looks like I'm just reading this too. I think it was actually kind of a rank thing. So everybody got to kind of rank it, and the ranks had to add up to
Okay.
100%.
Okay.
But kind of if you look at it across the ranks, they tended to for them the ethics and journalism was the top, and then like I said, the fight against social justice warriors was number two.
Oh, this is some good stuff in here too about a bunch of different questions about how people think about certain things.
Yeah.
Well, we could do a part two if you want to go through the rest of the data, but
Yeah, I'm open to that. Yeah, I'm cool with that. I'm having fun.
now here's one that obviously is useful because it comes up all the time. Because like for some reason the people who don't like GamerGate think that, well, you know what they think. How
Yeah.
often do you read Breitbart or Breitbart Tech for news that is not GamerGate related? Only 6%. Brad Glasgow told me this number too, and I just find it I find it pretty interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. This is where we're
well,
getting to the fun.
yeah. Well, it's often sort of like there's this narrative now. Like you've read Asia
Yeah,
Romano's article, I'm sure, that
yeah, yeah,
like GamerGate caused Trump to get elected, and
yeah.
Milo Yiannopoulos was the
Oh yeah,
bridge between gamers and Trump. Um, but like
yeah,
not really. Only 6% of the people
yeah.
read
Well,
his
there's
website frequently.
there's there's like a whole like meme or narrative or like just like a thread of like X post to X or Twitter, whatever the hell we're calling this thing now, right? Elon Musk thing. That you see this pop up very so often, like if only the media had paid more attention to Gamergate in 2014, then yeah, and then they tie it to something like, then we would have fewer fascists, Trump wouldn't have been president, cancer would have been cured, we would have made contact with the higher power by now. And any like, litany of horrible outcomes would have been avoided if only the media, which to my memory paid plenty of attention to Gamergate in 2014. I don't know what they wanted to do. I think it was in the New York Times and stuff like that. There is this kind of like fantasy that if only the media had paid more attention to Gamergate in 2014, then we'd be living in this kind of like Marxists, everybody holding hands and like dancing around the maypole, like social justice utopia. I don't know what they're envisioning was supposed to have happened if only not for Gamergate, kind of thing. But yeah, you do see, and these things get like I don't know how much of it is like bot farming or whatever kind of stuff, but you see these like posts that get like thousands of likes. And like you guys are idiots. The empirical data does not support this at all. I don't know what connection you think that Gamergate, whether you like it or not, had to Trump. Is yeah. I guess Breitbart covered it. Maybe I don't know, but it's like a really tenuous connection to draw this sort of sense of like oh well I don't know. Kamala Harris would be president today if only Gamergate hadn't happened in 2014. I don't know. All this kind of
No, well,
nonsensical stuff.
here we have the breakdown of the political views of the Gamergaters. Now you did for some reason your UK question doesn't show up, but it's fine.
Yeah,
Where do you consider yourself on the political spectrum? 34% liberal, 19% slightly liberal, 23% middle of the road slash moderate, 8% extremely liberal, 7% slightly conservative, 5% conservative, 1% extremely conservative, and 4% don't know slash haven't thought about it. What do you think of
yeah.
this finding? Was this a shock for you too, or was this more or less what you expected, kind of?
I don't know that we went in. I don't want to speak for Brad. I mean, I don't know that I went in expecting anything in particular. And I'll be honest. I think that my perspective on Gamergate kind of slowly shifted over time. In 2014, I really wasn't involved in it. So I didn't really participate in it, other than I do remember game politics was still up at the time, and I sort of followed it a little bit there, but I certainly wasn't active in either side of this whole thing. And I think I probably started in 2014 largely sympathetic to, I guess, what we would now call the anti-Gamergate side of things. Yeah, again, I wasn't like super involved, but I liked Anita Sarkeesian's first video, and I think some of the things that happened to her, were pretty horrible. So I sort of like started in this perspective of being kind of sympathetic to that type of argument, but without like, I wasn't like losing sleep over or anything, but it was just sort of an interesting thing to follow, and I generally like the idea of having positive representations of women in games, and I've written about that myself a little bit. So I kind of started in a pretty sympathetic position, I think, and then kind of like slowly over time, it's like dawned on me like I don't know, something's not washing here in this whole story, and part of it was like I said, I liked Anita's first video. And then I liked her second video too, and then she kept making more videos, and I liked them less and less as she made more and more. And I buy that there were like, I think the FBI's report was probably on target, that there were a couple jerks that were like really obsessive about harassing women, and they're assholes, and but they didn't represent gamers like as a whole, and so I started getting really uneasy with this kind of narrative that like gamers are bad, that like all gamers are bad, and it occurred to me that there was never any evidence that for the harassment that had occurred, that Sarkeesian experience and other people, Brianna Wu experience and other people experienced, Lee Alexander, whatever. There was no evidence that, and I did say this at the time. There's no evidence it was gamers that were doing it. I'm sure some of these women did experience some of these things, but it could have just been like random trolls, 4chan guys or something like that. I don't
And
know.
we do know that some of the people were trolls, and they did go after
Yeah.
people on both sides. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so you're kind of assuming that everybody is saying. I don't know why people like always do this. Like, someone says something online that is highly, sexist, racist, whatever, and you take it at face value. You assume that they really believe that, as opposed to they're just like trying to wind you up, kind of thing. And that was like I try to say like, yeah, I mean, this sucks. I mean, these women should not be experiencing these things. It's horrible that they're experiencing it for whatever reason that they're experiencing that. But that doesn't mean that the people who are doing it, they could be like Russian bots, for all that you know. We don't know that it's even human beings that are doing this necessarily. And so I got kind of uncomfortable with that. And then I'm answering your question in a very long way, but I haven't forgotten it. And I started getting really uncomfortable with. I started hearing people talking like all gamers, or like the game community has this problem with sexism or this kind of stuff. I don't know. I kind of feel like you're like, if you said this about like African Americans, right? Like that would be obviously, bad, like, stereotypical, prejudicial, racist, whatever. But for some reason, when you talk about gamers, it's okay to just like paint with this broad brush and assume that like there's a widespread problem in this community, despite you not having any evidence that is the case. So I became more and more like concerned about that, but I think I went into this with I don't know, I think it would have been exciting either way, that
Yeah.
if it
No, it
turned out
could be.
if it turned out the narrative was that they really were right wing, then okay, that's sort of interesting, right? In this case, it turned out they weren't.
Well, so I want to go through, just because we only got 2 minutes left now, and
Yeah,
that's my fault. Yeah. So
it's all good.
I spent too much
If you want
time
to talk,
focusing on the early questions. The early.
yeah.
So, all right. So speed round, just really quick. 83% believe in global warming and think that we need to do something to address it.
Yep.
Um, 84% believe that minorities have just as much chance to succeed as anyone else.
Hmm.
90% believe marijuana should be legal. 64% oppose the death penalty. 95% are pro-gay marriage. 67% believe that a man who transitions into a woman should be considered a woman. 91% believe abortion should be legal. And 78% believe that health care should be a public service provided by the government.
Hmm.
These are, except for maybe actually no, these are basically all like liberal values, I guess.
Yeah, they
Um,
are liberal values. Yes.
well, so the one that I think it's a liberal value. It's not a progressive value. Is that
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
minorities one, because I think if you asked like the super wokest people out there, they would be like,
Yeah,
absolutely not. Um,
yeah.
but if you
That's fair. Yeah,
but like well, and even like I think a lot of black people would probably actually answer that they think that there are systemic injustices probably.
yeah,
I mean I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, so I don't want to like speak uneducatedly about it,
sure. Yeah,
but it seems like these are all very liberal answers. They identify as liberals. Everyone who I've interviewed, pretty much every single pro GamerGate person, I should say, thinks that GamerGate was a very diverse group of people and not mostly right wing. But for some reason, even though there's no data on this showing it seems to be repeatedly promoted over and over and over again. Like, why do you, what do you think of this?
yeah. It's interesting because like I said, I mean, you see these threads like on Twitter, right? And I actually will sometimes say, well, just in case you're curious, here's some actual data, right? Um, it is fascinating to me the extent to which people adopt these beliefs about the world that are not data based, right? And I think that the motivation for this is, people are tribal, people in many for many reasons take moral positions not to help other people, but to signal their own like social value. So I kind of tell my students this a lot. Like, if you kind of assume like everybody's basically bad, then their behavior starts to make a lot more sense in a way. So you would think like if you're like really worried about like any of these issues, like let's say like we're worried about like abortion, right? And I actually have a pretty neutral opinion on abortion. I see both sides of this sort of thing, but if we're kind of like worried about like we want to make sure women have good access to appropriate medical interventions when they need it, that maybe a 3-week old blastocyst is not really a human yet, or I don't know, we could have all these kind of debates, right? But if you're kind of like worried about like women's well-being, then taking a data-based perspective, which may be kind of nuanced, right, is probably going to be the best way of advancing that cause, right? But taking the most extreme version, you end up with kind of this idea of like we call like a moral purity spiral, right? And what that means is basically if you get a group of people for whom taking moral positions indicates status, then you end up with a competition. The people that become more and more extreme in that moral position end up with higher and higher status, essentially. So it becomes not really about, say, helping women get access to, the health care that they need, and more about where is my status in this group of people that ostensibly are talking about women's well-being, but really are just trying to, maximize our own position and status in this organization. And the way to do that is to say, look at me, my moral position is better than yours, you're not pure enough, and therefore you're like a heretic, right? And so I think a lot of like progressive and conservative, organizations are kind of experiencing this right now, that you can't criticize any aspect of your side, or else you're a fascist or a communist, depending on which side you are on. So I think as a consequence, people take these really, really rigid views of complicated things that to a normal human being look pretty ridiculous to some extent, but to them, their status is built upon taking this position. So for them to say, Gamergate people are evil fascists, Trump supporters who want Nazis to, march through Washington, D.C. with swastikas and this kind of stuff, is an indication of their own comparative moral value, right? I'm the good person because look, I'm pointing this out, that this is a problem. This is Gamergate is like the starting point of disaster, the end of democracy in the United States. I'm, Paul Revere shouting this to the rooftops to warn anybody. And then you have an idiot like me that comes along and says, well, actually, they mostly voted for Obama, right? And it like pisses these people off, right? You know what I mean? Like, it's like, no, it completely challenges their status, right? So it's unlike, like we were kind of saying, like, oh, that actually is kind of interesting. Like, it turns out, like, we kind of thought, like, Gamergate people were these, like, right-wing misogynists, which, like I said, I actually was probably kind of sympathetic to that view at one point. And then you find more data says, well, no, actually, they're kind of progressives, or at least liberals, as you would say, right? Then, well, that's actually kind of fascinating information. And now I need to kind of like change my view of the world a little bit. But if you've kind of built your status on one particular very rigid view, it's very, very difficult to back away from that view. And so I think like the strategy with this is like you can't like those people you can't convince, right? I mean they're just so down the rabbit hole that to admit that they've been so horribly wrong at this point would be very, very difficult. They'd lose the status that they built up in these communities, right? And I think that's kind of what we see sometimes with like the game study stuff, right? It's really difficult for game studies scholars to admit that okay, maybe we're a little too progressive, like maybe we've become really, really rigid and authoritarian in our own views of this stuff, and maybe we shouldn't smear all gamers because they built their status, on doing exactly that, their whole academic career on doing exactly that, and so I mean the strategy really is kind of like trying to separate the normies, if you will, from that small group of people, and the fence sitters, the people who are maybe are they are Obama voters, yeah, they are Biden voters, they are progressive, but they're not nuts. You know what I mean? And you kind of say like, all right, yeah, I get it. You're worried about like right wing. I'm not a Trump voter either. I like democracy. I'm in favor of gay marriage and all this kind of stuff. But I don't know. Maybe we're wrong about this one, right? And that's kind of okay. That doesn't really mean that if it turns out GamerGate supporters were liberals on average, more liberal than the general population, that doesn't mean we have to change our views toward. It's still bad if you harass women, right? I mean, so it's not really like a core view if you're trying to advocate for like women in gaming and that kind of stuff. You can change your mind about Gamergate, and acknowledge that maybe there were some nuances in there, and that's okay. So I think you kind of have to figure out ways of like convincing the larger group of people who just are not personally dedicated to this kind of like moral position, and separate them out from the real neurotic folks who just can't like get away from it. And so I mean I think there's a combination of like opening doors so most people have the ability to change their mind while saving face, and saving face is important, giving people the opportunity to save face, in order to help persuade them to adopt a new view is critical. But for the people you can't reach, I hate to say it, but maybe a little bit of ridicule or satire can be effective in some of these situations. Again, give people the opportunity to change. But if they don't, and then say, like, look, you have on your lawn, you have a sign saying, "In this house, we believe science is real." But here's some data, and you don't like it, So how do you reconcile those two positions? And just kind of see where it goes. And I think that actually is happening. I think I've been kind of negative about academia a little bit when we've been talking, and I think academia does have a lot of challenges. But I think we're starting to see a little bit of a course correction in general about politics and academia, and I think that. Having some data like this one might help people understand that yeah, I mean bad shit happened in 2014, but the whole narrative around Gamergate is maybe a lot more nuanced and complicated than the binary morally satisfying view, and that's okay, and we can accept that that is true and still advocate for women in gaming, right? And these are not diametrically opposed positions, and you don't have to believe that all gamers are toxic misogynists in order to also argue that hey, I mean the new Tomb Raider looks good, and that's new being, was it like 2013, the newish Tomb Raider looks pretty good. I think most people can come around to that, but it takes a lot of effort to get people there.
Well, Chris, with this data here, I really look forward to seeing the new narrative on Gamergate that it was a misogynistic harassment campaign, but they were diverse and they were liberal, but they still harassed women. I can't wait.
Yep. Sounds good. Sounds good.
All right. Well, hey, thank you so much for coming on. You can do the second part of the interview. We can schedule a second time, and we can do. I feel like unless there's something specifically you want to go over in the survey, I feel like
Yeah.
we can move on to my question list next time, or I can just send it to you, and you could do it over text if you prefer. Uh,
Oh, yeah.
Either way
Next week's.
works
I mean,
because if it's over
yeah.
text, then it's a book exclusive, which makes people buy the book.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
But if it's over video, you're a pretty credible person, I feel. So, and
Depends on who you ask.
you've
Yeah.
done the you've done the work. So that's good content for my channel too. So either way, I'm down. Just let me know.
Sounds good. Yeah, we can chat. I was gonna say, I don't know what your time frame looks like. Yeah, next week spring break, so I have a lot more clear schedule next week. But yeah, let's chat via email. We'll find a time maybe and move forward.
All right, now go enjoy your D&D, friend. And
All right, I
chat,
appreciate it.
thanks for watching. Like the video. Oh, and by the way, I am now monetized on YouTube. Not ads yet, but I you can become a member if you support the work that I'm doing. If you think I'm doing a good job with the book, or you want to support what I'm doing with this channel and stuff in general, and my projects that I'm working on, please consider becoming a YouTube member. I just unlocked it like 2 days ago or yesterday, and you can support me on a regular basis, support the work that I do with this. So yeah, consider it and leave a comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Have a good night, everyone. We're gonna be rating Stardust. Go say hi to her and check out what's she doing. Sneako drama. Okay, well, have fun with the Sneako drama.